So this video will be looking at microevolution part 2, talking about variation and how variation can occur, and a couple other things. So this variation, of course, makes sense to us, right? Different traits exist within a given species or a population. You think about our own species and all the different variations that can occur. This picture's a good example of that. Even in our own school, we see a ton of variation as we walk down the halls, and this is very normal for our species. All species, in fact, have similar kinds of variation. We don't typically notice this in other species because, we're not them, but we notice it in our own. Were we to be able to look through the eyes of a bear or a fish, we might notice those kinds of variations better. Now, something simple like this, these shells, we can easily see that. Now, a couple things. Variation is good because it provides more adaptation, more fitness, because inevitably one of those variants is going to be better than the other. Now, again, in our own population, we kind of are past that point almost as far as evolution is concerned, meaning that we don't really favor one trait over another, or at least theoretically we're not supposed to. But take for instance these shells, it might be that the white shell is better or the golden shell is better or whatever. Now, the reason I have this down here is to remind me to talk about something, but I made a slide for it already. And that's the fact that all variation finds its root in a change in the DNA. And a change in the DNA is a very simple term. It's a term we've learned before, and that is mutation. Ultimately, all variations are rooted in the fact that a mutation occurred at some point. Now, many mutations are bad. However, some mutations end up being beneficial and cause more fitness. Now, mutations can be neutral as well. You think about something like eye color or hair color in our own species is fairly neutral. But if you go back to the hunter-gatherer days, having a stronger upper body or faster legs or being taller as opposed to shorter or whatever, I don't know, those kinds of traits may have lent themselves to being more fit. And so the kinds of traits that produce more fitness typically, as we've learned, exist and keep it on. Now, so what are some other ways that variation can occur other than just simple mutation? Well, we've learned about these ways. Think about crossing over. Now, crossing over is not going to cause a change in the DNA, but what it's going to cause is it's going to cause alleles that normally wouldn't be linked together to be able to be linked together. And, we've talked about how you can see in this picture the blue chromosome takes little pieces of the red one, and the red one takes a little piece of the blue, and vice versa. And so this allows these different combinations to occur. And if you continue on thinking about meiosis, think about what happens in Anaphase 1 when sister chromatid or when homologous pairs are separated. And then you have homologous pair 1 and homologous pair 2 being separated. Well, which one does 2 go? Does part 2A go to the left or the right? We've done these drawings, and it doesn't matter. That's Mendel's principle of independent assortment. And so you end up having all these different combinations. And if you have 23 pairs of chromosomes like we do, then all of a sudden those combinations get very large in number. And then you think about the second separation that occurs, where you have the two sister chromatids that separate. And which direction do they go? And which ones pair with which other pair to make a gamete that is essentially unique? And then you take that essentially unique gamete and you combine it with another essentially unique gamete through the process of fertilization. And then you have this whole other degree of variance. And so you can see how very quickly variation can be very, very precise. And there's certain variations that are going to persist, obviously, in populations. And those variations are selected for, are the ones that survive. And again, in our own species, it's hard to make those kinds of connections. But if you think about a species that lives in the wild, an advantageous variation is going to help them every time, and that's eventually going to help the population as a whole, because remember, populations change over time, not necessarily individuals. Which leads me to this idea of micro versus macro evolution. We've talked about the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, and and how we can track the change in allele frequency over time. And that being a good definition of evolution, really, is the change in allele frequency. But really, we're only going to be tracking those things in small increments at small increments of time. Even 100 or 1,000 years is very small time as far as evolution is concerned. And so I have this picture here of the green bug on the green leaf to denote that obviously that is an advantageous situation for a bug, for there to be more green bugs, because green and green match and you're less likely to be eaten. If you're a brown bug, you're probably not going to make it. Well, fast forward, 60 million years. Eventually, you're going to have that brown bug, say, for instance, maybe it's going to start living on the ground where things are more brown. And eventually, the bugs in the tree and the bugs on the ground just aren't really into each other anymore. Fast forward a couple million years, and you have two completely different species. This is where we get more into this idea of macroevolution, which we'll spend more time talking about. So, the big difference here and the big idea is that microevolution over longer periods of time can lead to something like a macro change, which is the creation of a new species or even a new taxa, this whole other group. Now, we've said that natural selection isn't random. It's not random that the green bug is able to exist on the green leaf for longer. That is not random. However, random things can happen. Let's say that green bugs are doing really well on green leaves in this forest, but then lightning strikes and the forest burns down. It doesn't matter what color you are. If you were on a burning tree, you're likely to die. And so this would be an example of a random change. We call these random changes to the allele frequency genetic drift. Typically, genetic drift only affects smaller populations, that would make sense because a large population is less likely to be affected by a change in the allele frequency. We talked about that with Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. There are two kinds of genetic drift that we'll see. And that's just showing you the possible changes in allele frequency. Again, the big idea here is genetic drift equals random. Natural selection, not random. One example of this is called the bottleneck effect. And think about a bottle full of beads, like it shows there on the left, and pouring that bottle of beads out. Well, only a couple of beads are going to come out before the beads kind of get stuck in the bottleneck, and they're not able to come out. You'd have to spend a lot of time getting them to come out. And so that small group that manages to escape is the group that is the new population. And so think about a hurricane that ravages an island, and only a small number of survivors make it out of this population. Well, the hurricane doesn't, none of the individuals in that population are particularly adapted for a hurricane, which might be a random event. It's unpredictable. They can't be ready for that. And the ones that survive, it's just random. Even though a certain set, for instance, white in the beads may have been the best adapted, but now white is very small in the population because of a random event. And so this is bottlenecking. When a population is decreased significantly and a random sampling of that population exists afterwards. Very similar kind of a thing, still under genetic drift, is this idea of the founder's effect. And the founder's effect is when you have a small sampling of individuals, typically talking about humans in this idea because it makes more sense to us, but it could be any species really. And that small group moves off and founds a new location. Fast forward 1,000 years. What are all the individuals of that new location going to be like? They're going to look like those 8 that moved originally. This shows a picture of Native Americans. They weren't originally Native Americans. They were native to the continent of Asia, and they crossed over on the land bridge. And that small group of people that crossed over on the land bridge populated our continent. Were it a different small group, our continent would have had a completely different genetic makeup. And then fast forward, several thousand years when the first Europeans came over. they brought with them a particular set of genes. And that particular set of genes is what pretty much populated the majority of our continent or our country. And then fast forward even a couple hundred years later, and you think about incidents like the slave trade, which brought over a whole other subset of the population. And so you think about these little groups, small groups of population, and obviously Europeans that came over and the individuals that came over through the slave trade. This is a lot of people, but it represents a small portion of their original populations. And so they may have a completely different genetic makeup than the homeland, so to speak. And so it does change a population over time. And so this would be an example of that genetic drift. It's random. There wasn't a selection process that said these are going. It was a random kind of thing. Now, another change in populations is this idea of gene flow. It doesn't necessarily have to be random. It could be a purposeful kind of movement, which is what I have here. This is like you think about migration in and out of an area. This is a good thing. And then with migration, who is going to make it to the south when it gets cold in the north? Only the strongest birds. And so this is still going to affect that population, and it's going to affect the population of birds wherever they land because of the different effects that are going on there. And so this is an example of that. And you think about gene flow in that, think about immigration to our country. This is movement on purpose, meaning that those people chose to come here. They weren't selected for or anything like that. They just wanted to come over here for a particular reason. Well, they still changed the makeup of our population when they came. And so that has to do with just this idea of movement on purpose, changing the makeup and the genetic allele frequency of a population in that way.